And we are live with our 14th episode of Absolute AppSec. I am joined this evening by my co-host, Seth Law. Seth.
Hey, everybody. Welcome once again.
And our special guest for tonight, Karthik Gaekwad. And I hope I said that right.
Hey, man, you got it right. That's awesome.
Yay. Karthik, can you say hi to everybody? And
hello, I'm Karthik, and I'm happy to be here on the podcast.
Yeah, no, thanks for joining us. We've had some scheduling issues and we've had to reschedule and postpone. So we're really happy that we finally got this locked down and we're all here. So very exciting. I'm going to give a little bit of background on Karthik real quick. Karthik works on managed Kubernetes services at Oracle Cloud. He has been a regular speaker in, DevOps as well as security conferences. I remember meeting Karthik first at LastCon, so an OWASP conference out of Austin, Texas. That's where I first remember meeting you and seeing you speak. Excuse me. And also Karthik, amongst the things that we're going to talk about in his specialties, and a lot of it's in DevOps technologies and security. He organizes DevOps Days Austin, Container Days, and Cloud Austin. You're heavily immersed in the DevOps culture and community out there in Austin, Texas. I think that's a fair statement to make.
Yeah, I really think once you go DevOps, you can't go out. And being a part of the community, the DevOps community in general is very diverse and very broad. So once you start doing I think Ernest Muller, James Wakehead, and I, we started doing Cloud Austin, which was just a local meetup. And then that ballooned into DevOps Days Austin and Container Days, which became conferences that we do typically year-round in Austin, Texas. So it's kind of like, I think DevOps in general, there's a lot of, aspects to it. A lot of people say there's plans and culture, automation, measurement, sharing, lean, but the culture aspect of it is getting people together and talking about issues and problems. So that's kind of why we end up, doing a lot of things with the community in general.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of tooling that's specific to DevOps, but I think that you most commonly hear when people kind of describe DevOps, it's not about the tooling, it's about I gotta adjust this thing. It's about the culture. So
and I really think that's where the essence of just DevOps and the idea of DevOps kind of comes from. It's not, you can look in the market and get a tool, but a tool is not going to fix a lot of your culture problems. And that's something that kind of resonates over and over again in startups and smaller companies as well as enterprises.
Yeah, and what would you say that the culture is? It a thing of openness? Is it a thing of being willing to sort of move quick and break things? Is it more of building redundancy, fail-safe mechanisms, or is it you hear microservices and serverless talked about, which I know we're going to get into all that. But what's sort of the attributes of the culture?
I look at it, actually, it's a funny story. A lot of folks kind of ask how James, Ernest, and I kind of do a lot of stuff together, like present day, and what our origin story is. And our origin story actually comes from a company we worked at together, National Instruments in Austin. So back in the day, this is 11 years ago at this point, but I started on, it was my first real job, and I was on the commerce team over there just as a developer, and I was writing applications. And Ernest and James, they were I think Ernest was the web operations manager, and James worked for him at the time. And so in our world, a lot of stuff was based in PL SQL, and we were kind of going towards Java and the new way for our enterprise back in the day. And like I had a lot of questions on. I was like, hey, how do you like what should I be doing in terms of like I want to log all these things, but I don't want to set the logs on fire because we used Splunk at the time, and I didn't want to like bombard Splunk with like a lot of debug logs and stuff like that. So I kind of opened a conversation with Ernest and Peiko, actually, who's another of our friends who works as an Agile admin on the Agile admin blog. And so we started this conversation about logging, and then they were really like taken aback because a lot of times developers and ops never really talk to each other about stuff. And I was like, I'm trying to fix this problem with my application, and I was trying to be a little proactive about that. And that kind of led to, doing like wanting to do monitoring for the application and things like that, and bring about more operational concerns. And they were working on different initiatives to try and bring, ops a little bit up front. And I was trying to, go into the ops world to try and make my application more resilient. So we kind of met in the middle. And ironically, like about 5 years in, or maybe like 2.5 years in, we ended up writing a lot of web products for NI. So we were in IT initially, and then when we went into the product side to write SaaS-based applications for the flagship application that NI had, which was LabVIEW. And so we were trying to figure out how to do like the whole SaaS thing. But this time around, we were all in one team. And so we were like a DevOps team in our organization. So we had like 6 folks on the team, 3 of which were ops and 3 of them were devs. So it was really interesting because we would have these conversations about code, but we'd have like an ops person also kind of listening in and giving us, recommendations and things we should be doing with respect to like connection pooling and stuff like that. So it was kind of like an interesting time. And this is, looking back, it's like 7 years ago now, where we were kind of working together. But to me,
I did have a question because correct me if I'm wrong. I think the first talk I ever saw you give was on how to write a secure API or authentication around an API, something like that. Did that come out of that work there specifically?
Yeah, so I ended up writing the authentication API for our SaaS modules. And then there was a lot of things that we kind of learned as a team, like best practices that you want to think about when you're writing, authentication, authorization, all of those blocks. And that's actually like followed me around in my career because the first time I wrote it, I was like, wow, this, you want to do things using these specific patterns. And that was the talk that I'd given, I think, at LastCon, which is, the LastCon conference many years ago. But
I was sitting in the front row watching.
Yeah, I remember that. And it's funny because, like, I didn't know your name. I just knew it was CK Tricky. I'm like, I don't know who that CK Tricky guy is, but he's really cool.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, no, I remember watching and being like, this shit is what people need to hear because, I still get that question. Like, how do you, it's very generic. Like, well, it's either how do you test an API or most often, like, how do you make a secure API?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like, that is still a thing and this was, I think you gave the talk, I don't know what year, 2013, maybe something like that.
2012, 2013, somewhere around there.
Yeah. I mean, it's still 5 years later.
Mm-hmm.
People still are confused.
Yeah. And part of it, I think, goes back. That's a really interesting question because you can almost take out the word API and put that in X, and people would like ask, how do I make X more secure? Like you heard that with containers, like how do I make my containers all secure? How do I make my Kubernetes all secure? And so in some ways, I feel like that's the wrong question that's being asked. And instead, it's like you think about it, more proactively, and maybe we should like think about rephrasing that question to being to something else. And so, which ends up being a little bit more productive, maybe. But the $1 million questions, I don't know what the actual question is.
You just know what the answer is? Is that, is this a 42 style situation?
Yeah.
That's an interesting, problem we always run into. I mean, we all get that question, it seems to be the reason that we're all employed, for one reason or another, right? But
yeah, and more on the API front, like it is, programmers love like freedom and tooling. So a lot of people, when they write REST APIs, you end up having like many ways to solve like one single problem.
Yeah.
It's a nightmare on the security standpoint, because you're like, well, how do you even go about, locking this down or making sure like all these things conform to something specific? And it's really like too easy for a developer to go and like, write one specific endpoint and forget to put authentication or something on there, and you're exposed. And that's why we get a lot of hacks where people are like, oh, I found this like random endpoint here which I didn't think was supposed to be alive, or it had no op on it, and I found all this data.
Yeah, I mean that's why we always search for those broken access control vulnerabilities, right? I mean, I think about doing like code reviews, and those are I seem to find those all the time. Like, I mean, it's the RESTful endpoints, it's things like Node, or like I like to call them the hipster languages, right? Because I'm old apparently, but the new languages that allow this routing mechanism to be built into the code itself, and it's very easy to forget your authorization, decorators or tags or how you're doing it, and there's no one standard for implementing that, right? Node does it different than Django, than Rails, and somebody uses middleware to handle it in one situation, and then another it's built in. So it's yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. That's what I'm getting at. So, but along those lines, right? Like I haven't seen this LastCon talk. Maybe give us a short rundown of what it was that you went through on that, because it obviously sounds like it's still relevant. If you're still getting the question, if we're still getting it, what was that? You don't have to dig into specifics. Just give us a short overview of what it was, and then we'll make people go dig it up.
Yeah, I was trying to think through like the stuff I saw, and from what I remember, we had talked about a lot of. At the time, we were moving to the cloud, so a lot of people, ended up using the web server to, cache tokens and stuff like that, and used mechanisms that were provided by, let's say, WebLogic or something like that to do authentication. But part of the talk kind of focused on, okay, if you were not going to use capabilities that were provided by the actual web server, what would you do? So that some of it focused on, okay, here's an example of authentication broken down into REST-style services. So you might have a login endpoint. You might pass your credentials to that login endpoint, get a token which expires at X amount of time, and use that specific token with your call for your other APIs. And then the rest of it kind of focused on, okay, here's how like you have your user credentials. What are different things you would need to do in order to save those securely in a database. Don't use just like rand hashing for like hashing well, first of all, hash your passwords, but also do that in a secure manner. Like don't use just random number or whatever, but use decrypt or something like that. And talked about also like storing stuff in. I think we had stored our things in like MySQL or whatever, but if think about it from a hacker perspective, he gets access to one single table. You don't want everything, even if things are hashed, you don't want him to get access to all of that. So maybe store your salts in a different place, in different tables or different databases, just to make things a lot more difficult. From like if you have one thing that's exposed, it's not everything. So it kind of went into detail on just ideas for things that you should do or think about when you're building a REST-style service that does authentication, authorization, all that.
Cool. Yeah, I mean it does sound very relevant, right? Today with the way that the cloud has gone and the way that we're building things. I mean, nowadays you can depend on Amazon for half of that, or the cloud provider to do the authentication and authorization for you.
Yep.
But at the same. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like early microservices security talk, right?
Right.
Well, yeah, and
did we lose Ken?
We may have lost Ken.
I don't know. He just paused. So.
11 years ago, since Karthik had mentioned 11 years ago, or longer. Essentially, you had like a data center, and you'd have some bare metal hardware, and You run your application, which probably hogs a fair amount of resources on that server. But you've got developers who write code, ops people that make that work and eat up those resources and use that box essentially. Others who might work on like the networking standpoint. So all that stuff's divided up, and it's, you know, one application, one database typically. Kind of a relationship, even if that's like scaled out, it's still that kind of relationship. And now what we're talking about is, as things have shifted, and I know we're going to get into this, but then you started seeing maybe more of like APIs where you've got, instead of just it being HTML and everything on like this one, you know, in this one app, we'll say code base. Now you have maybe multiple code bases, multiple applications. You've got APIs, you've got front end JavaScript that are its own thing that then communicates and makes calls off to a separate application, which is just an API, which Karthik talked about skewing. And then to further like watch the evolution you're talking about, you've got, and I think we should get into this, which is now we're going away from even writing your own fully baked API application to like serverless, where they're just functions that do one thing, such as like AWS's Lambda. So you send a request to it and it does one interaction on whatever it has access to. Could be S3, could be a database, could be whatever, SMS or SNS to send off messages, whatever the case is, you don't know. And then you're using something like, because Seth you had just mentioned like using cloud providers authentication, right? So like API gateway tied in with Cognito, whatever other services are out there I'm not even familiar with. I know there's a lot out there, and Karthik, I'm sure you're going to talk to us about some of that. But just giving people kind of an idea of that evolution who may not have this whole background on it. Hopefully that's succinct enough. You guys have anything to add to that? I mean, I'm sure you have some stuff to add to that, Karthik.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we're at this point right now where, and working at Oracle, this is something that I see quite a lot. I find that enterprises are just kind of realizing, hey, we need this container thing, and we need. People have also been talking a lot about config management, which kind of came before. Like there was DevOps, and DevOps kind of came at the same time as config management, and then you had containers, and then most recently you've had the serverless movement, which has been around like I guess there's been a lot of buzz about that like last 2 years, probably a little give or take, but a lot of folks have kind of been going between like, should I use containers and Kubernetes, or should I go directly to serverless? Like what paradigm should I be learning right now? And it feels like a lot of the from a startup perspective, it does seem like a lot of folks are kind of moving more towards, just using serverless and serverless architectures, because I think the mind shift is completely different from, building applications where you're building applications and you were just packaging them in a different way. And that's what containers kind of gave you. And then when you add Kubernetes on top of that, that helps you like orchestrate your whole application and microservices in a more organized way. But then when you kind of flip completely to serverless, it's almost like, well, we're kind of thinking about everything from an async process perspective, and everything is kind of like a job queue or something like that. And then you have your front end kind of interacting with your application, with your your backend applications from a serverless standpoint. So it does feel like there's this like shift right now where we're going from just like especially in the enterprise, where we're going from a single, here's my application deployed on the stack, and it's very clean, and then they're like, well, we put them in containers now, but it's still like the same stuff. And okay, now you're telling me I need to break this up into multiple containers, or are you telling me that I need to like rip everything apart and make it like this serverless thing? So I do think there's some amount of confusion, and realistically, it's hard to tell. Like when Docker first came out in 2012, 2013, around that time, people like latched onto it really quickly, both devs and ops, because devs were like, hey, this is a way that I can communicate with the operations point of view, and I know exactly how to like give them something to deploy, because that used to be a hard problem. You'd be like, here's here's source control, and there you go, right?
Your problem now, buddy.
Right. But containers kind of introduced like that clean packaging platform. But then serverless, I think, helps more from a developer perspective, where it's like you kind of like think of your application, and to a certain extent, the ops focus shifts a little bit more to monitoring and logging, making sure the application is resolving to a certain uptime and things like that. But you're not actually like managing your app to begin with, and I think that is kind of a hard like learning curve from an ops perspective for an enterprise, which might just kind of be stepping into that whole paradigm.
So I mean, is that I'm gonna sorry, Seth.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just gonna ask, because that was before you even answer, before I even asked the question, you started answering it, which was, you've got access to this huge community. Is that how you're seeing, like, to what extent are devs involved in like software developers involved in the deployment process? And it sounds like, I mean, like, to get real granular, like, would a dev in most environments be modifying their Docker file, or would that be like ops doing that? Or, how far down the pipeline into deployment do developers typically that you see tend to get?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of the work when I worked at Stack Engine, which was the company that got acquired into Oracle, like we used to write a product that was basically an orchestrator. So you have Docker containers, and then you could kind of tell, hey, I want this application to run on this node, and kind of like load balance and do all of that stuff. And we actually ended up talking to a lot of customers that wanted to go into containers 100%. And so it was really interesting. Like the smaller shops that had I think a lot of folks kind of say it's like the 10-to-1 ratio, where there are 10 developers to one ops person. A lot of in the smaller startups, there used to be a lot of like developers kind of championing, hey, we should be using containers. So and from that perspective, I think they would go down pretty deep to almost they would have the Docker file kind of written, and then they were like, okay, we have this, we had the images stored, we have the images stored in an image repository. Now we need to figure out how to deploy that, and then that's kind of where that shift would go into ops. But in the larger organizations that had an ops team or ops teams that were trying to support development teams, like in those shops, we saw a lot more of, okay, so I'm in the ops organization, and I want to make my development lifecycle for my developers a little bit easier. So they would kind of like have sample Docker files for Java applications or Ruby applications or whatever, and then have samples of that kind of scaled out using their infrastructure, and then kind of pitch that backwards to developers. Be like, hey, look, this is a Ruby app, running on four machines or whatever, and it's load balanced. And how would you model your specific application to do something like this? So it kind of went both ways, and that's why I think it's like a great kind of meeting in the center point. And we, one of the guys I worked with at Oracle and at Stack Engine, like he was our ops guy, but he was like the guy that I needed to be talking to make sure that my Docker file was up to date, making sure it was minimized or minified and things like that. And that's something as developers, like we just sometimes start with, I'm a Golang guy, so I'll start, from Golang in my Docker file. But really, you don't want to do that. You kind of want to, have the smallest attack area or surface attack area. And a lot of times, like, that's where kind of security comes in. That's where kind of operations comes in to actually just build a more stable application and just a more secure application in general.
So if you, I mean, it's good. It's good for us to the reason I ask is because, sometimes it's sort of like making assumptions on how all this looks, and I don't have access to the pool of people that you do. So that's a good, that's kind of the background on why I asked that, to get a feel for kind of how that was, trending, I should say. Now there was another piece that I wanted to definitely get into and ask you about on that note. Like if you, let's say because this comes up, by the way, like fairly often, which is I am not a huge security team. I'm a small shop, and what can I do today? Because I've got developers, not ops people. I've got developers in this environment deploying containers. What can I do to keep my environment? Let's say they're deploying containers, they're using Kubernetes. What can they do? How can they get started in securing their setup, essentially? Like automating it, like automating as much as they can.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and we actually get that quite a bit right now. And I think the first thing to do either way is making sure that there's some kind of pipeline. So your code lives in source control. Whenever you push your code to source control, there's some kind of thing, some kind of build or whatever that's kicked off, whether that's Jenkins, Circle CI, or whatever, or Travis or whatever. Like there's something that kicks it off. That essentially like ends up building your containers for you. And I think that's a great place for security to kind of plug in. I think the CNCF, or Cloud Native Computing Foundation, they've actually done a lot of work, like bringing the whole community together. And one of the interesting things about just CNCF in general is it's more, when it was formed, like it was a lot of developers. Actually, I think it was like split of developers and operations, but like over time, it's grown into like a really good like developer security operations kind of community. And they have this like landscape, the CNCF landscape. If you Google that, it'll kind of show you like the different pieces in it. And there's a part in there where like where they talk about just securing images in general. So if you're not a large shop, for example, one thing you probably want to do a lot of is making sure that the images that your development teams are building, you actually go scan them on a semi-regular basis. Docker Hub, if you're an enterprise customer, does that automatically for you, and they'll look for CVC scans and stuff like that, or CVC issues and things like that. But if you don't use Docker Hub and you're doing something locally,
do you know if they because I don't actually know this off the top of my head, do they look through your Docker file, like, because I'm assuming there's CVEs on it's CVEs on the images you're downloading, but do they look at like if you're doing anything insecure in terms of your like line by line instructions on Docker files?
That's a good. I think they do, because I think they, like, if you end up adding, like if you start from a Ruby base and end up adding whatever in there, they'll look for like specific patterns or whatever. So it's kind of specific to whatever image you end up building, and they end up scanning that specific image.
Okay.
And so if there's a CVE based on that, they'll be like, oh, this is I got something weird in here, so I'll make sure that I go and fix that. So that's there.
Like roll back a tiny bit, right, with the scanning that you're talking about, just so that we make sure that everybody understands. What sort of things are you, because you mentioned CVEs, that they're checking for CVEs in that scan. So what is it exactly that they're looking for in Docker versus something like a vulnerability scan, or like, a network scan, just kind of what that is, what that looks like?
I think mostly it's looking for like what's it called? Static analysis. So like it'll scan for like any kind of static vulnerabilities and things like that. One of the good things one of the tools that you can look for is called Clair, CLAIR, and that came from the folks at CoreOS. And so they kind of Docker does it automatically, but you can also get Claire, run it locally in your own ecosystem, and that looks for like your does like a static analysis of your containers or your images basically, and tells you.
So it's scanning and looking for out-of-date packages and vulnerabilities within that framework, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, in application security, when we start talking static analysis, I start thinking of Fortify and static level analysis of the code, but this is actually static level analysis of the operating system, right?
Yep. Operating system and then whatever else you've like installed on there. So if you put something, insecure or whatever in that specific container, which has the OS and everything else in there, it'll actually look for that too.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I didn't mean to derail you too much, but we do have kind of a different understanding, right? I mean, and we've got to understand that, right? From a DevOps perspective, I need to understand what you guys are looking at as opposed to what I look at from an AppSec perspective, because those two things have to match up, right?
Yep.
You're running static analysis. I want to make sure that your static analysis covers something different than mine. We're not like duplicating effort, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and then there's one of the projects that I was kind of looking at most recently. There's a company called AppSec in the Kubernetes world, and they kind of do a lot of work from a security perspective. But they actually released a tool called KubeBench recently, which I took a quick look at, and that thing actually runs through your Kubernetes install and make sure that it adheres to specific like security principles and best practices for your Kubernetes installation. And that's really important because if you look at how to install Kubernetes, there's like many ways that you can do that. So it kind of looks through like your Kubernetes install, make sure that you're kind of doing all the right things that you need to. And if you're not, it'll kind of give you an error or give you some information up front. And I think that's super useful because a lot of people are kind of, doing a Kubernetes install just YOLO. And so that helps out from that perspective.
Yeah. And doesn't that implement the CI security, or it's checking the CI security benchmark, right? The CIS benchmark.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So that, and then I think there's a lot of other interesting things too, like from a image perspective, the CNCF ended up adding like the Tough framework in there. It's like a framework for like secure scanning that everybody kind of corresponds to, and then Notary I think implements that. So Notary is like the tool that you would use to scan your images that's like the CNCF blessed implementation of it. But Claire is kind of similar to that, and there's a whole bunch of others. But a couple of companies do kind of, if you're looking for solutions in that space, AppSec, Black Duck, Anchor. Anchor is like ANCHORE, I believe. All of those guys are kind of doing a lot of interesting security related things with respect to containers.
And I've linked AppSec, Claire, Black Duck, the
CNCF, yeah.
CNCF, yeah. So I put those links inside the live chat, so they'll be available for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, it really does feel like the Wild West right now in the container space, right? You're looking at Docker containers, and everybody's got a solution. I didn't go to RSA this year, and not too broken up about it, but cloud security was a thing last year when I went, right? But definitely this year would have been the main cloud. I shouldn't say cloud. I should say container security or Docker security, right? Knowing whether or not you're vulnerable there, right? It seems like there's a whole bunch of growth. There's a lot of companies in that space right now. So I expect there'll be some consolidation, and people will start to suck up those tools and combine them with your Qualys or whatever, right?
Yeah, I think it's. I went to KubeCon in December of last year, and I went to the show floor, and there were, I think there were about 4,000 people who went to the conference, but the show floor was pretty packed with a lot of vendors. And it's kind of evolved because when Docker first came out, there were a lot of vendors trying to provide solutions for just containers in general. but then there was confusion on, like what would kind of win from an orchestration standpoint. So there was a lot of questions whether, we Docker Swarm, Kubernetes, Mesos, and all of that. But that's kind of evolved into people wanting, the community kind of wanting to use Kubernetes as, your container orchestration platform or container management platform. And so now I think a lot of vendors are kind of trying to integrate with, hey, how do I make, people are going to build applications on top of Kubernetes, how do we kind of build like a stronger kind of stronger tooling on top of that, or from a security standpoint, stronger defense and stuff like that from a Kubernetes standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? Like it's kind of the natural evolution of the different technologies, for lack of a better overarching term, right? Or aspects or development frameworks, I guess. Right? However, we present these applications to the public.
Sure. Yeah, and I think like just Kubernetes in general, when I first started using this a couple of years ago now, I was like, I really liked upfront that it told you, hey, if you have something that's a secret, like, you have MySQL password or something like that, put that into a Kubernetes secret. And that was something that they baked in from like version like 0.3 or something like that. Like it was like very early on that they were like, oh, people have these things that need to be safe. And so it like, let's introduce this concept of secrets. And a lot of people kind of use HashiCorp's Vault as a secret implementation behind the scenes. So like a lot of people kind of use that alongside Kubernetes to kind of store their secrets and get that and integrate that into your container pipelines. But it's good to know that there's the idea of security is not like a last kind of thing, and it's brought up front. But that being said, like Kubernetes secrets by default, they're only like if you can go and figure out what they are, they're just basically encoded, so it's not like something magical. But at least at rest, like if you can get into the container, you can still find out what it is. But at least there's like effort being put into it up front.
Huh. I didn't know about the base 64 piece.
Okay, that's something to add to our GitHub searches, right? Or for our container analysis. So, and I mean, is that the main reason that you see people using those third-party solutions like HashiCorp Vault, is just the level of security around those Kubernetes secrets, or is that just an implementation of Kubernetes, like how you tell it how to define those?
No, I think like Vault actually ends up being a lot more robust from a security standpoint.
Okay.
Than, just using like plain Jane Kubernetes secrets. But it's and I think Kelsey Hightower had a presentation maybe last year or sometime where he actually integrated Vault as like the secret provider for Kubernetes. I haven't actually like gone and like played with it, but I know there are a lot of companies that kind of do that from hey, we have these things that are sensitive, we need to store them somewhere. Okay, we'll use Vault to actually store those, and then build an API on top of that to kind of push that into Kubernetes.
Yep. Interesting. Sorry, Ken.
Oh, I was going to mention what Ken Toller had said. Him mentioning that it's Vault's a great kind of stepping stone into moving from a legacy app to containers. I'm guessing he's saying get your legacy apps on Vault, and then it's easier to make that migration.
That is a great idea. I never thought of it that way because I don't do a lot of like legacy migration kind of stuff. But that's like, that would be like your first step that you want to do before you do like YOLO with containers or whatever you want to call it.
Go crazy, go nuts with you crazy kids with your containers. Yeah.
Hipster languages and containers. Gosh.
Hey, Seth, so I was going to ask you, when you said hipster languages, do you consider Go to be a hipster language?
Go?
Yeah, like Golang?
Yes.
Hey, I was going to mention
what kind
on
of
that
question was that, right?
Well,
does everyone have beards that programs in Golang? Yes, right? It's
I've been to Go meetups before, and Seth, it doesn't feel very, it feels very, it feels more like a, I don't mean this in a rude way, but it feels more like a meeting of the chess club or the mathletes than it does hipster group.
I guess hipster, I should say modern languages. I don't know, and anything that's not your classic, Java and .NET from back in the day.
Is Java 9 a hipster language?
I don't even want to get into that. Is it really a language, right? Is it? Yeah.
No, I've actually been doing Go a couple, not a couple. How many years has it been? Like 4 years now, probably. And then it kind of grew on me because when I first started out, I was like, it's kind of hard to get my head wrapped around it because I used to be at NI. We always did just everything in Java and some stuff in C#, and then went to Ruby for a little while, went to Python for a little while, and then we ended up settling on Go just because. Like the build process is really simple. Like you end up using just binary and shipping that off, and you can kind of run it wherever. So that's kind of like what brought me to it, and it's kind of grown on me a lot over time.
No, it's like, I mean, my hipster language definition is pretty loosey goosey, right? It's more like the modern language paradigm, I should say, right? So you could argue that, like .NET Core and some of those other, new technologies from the old state, like companies are hipster as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
But, I mean, and it's not a knock on them whatsoever, right? I haven't written like a full blown Java application in years. So they're much easier to use, right? So.
What's funny, Karthik, is that I don't remember when this was, but it was probably within the last year and a half or so. I was like doing a Go code review, and I'm like, what the heck? Like, what resources out there? And guess whose presentation showed up? So I was looking at your material. I'm like, oh, Karthik wrote this. That's cool, because I mean there wasn't a ton like of Go security related stuff. I was going to ask you, so when you say you're using Go, are you using Go for like web specific, like handling web requests and whatnot, or is it in a different capacity?
No, I mean, I work on the managed Kubernetes team at Oracle. So like Kubernetes itself, like all of that stuff is written in Go. Containers like Docker, all that stuff is written in Go. So when I first started, it was just basically writing web apps, and then before Stack Engine, I worked at Signal Sciences, and like we kind of ended up. That's where I first started like to learn Go from a web application standpoint. But mostly it's been like some of it's been like writing the APIs in Go and like all of the backend processing and all of that. And then I also dabbled a little bit with like writing a front end in Go, but then I was like, you probably want to use like a more modern thing. You can do it, but it doesn't make it. You'd have to use jQuery or something like that with it, which I don't think web developers like that. But it's been a lot of just like writing APIs and backend kind of stuff using Go.
Yeah, I mean the build process, that deployability makes it pretty attractive, right?
Yep.
To developers, paired with a modern React front end or Angular front end, and you're off and running, right?
I'll tell you from a code review standpoint, Go is way easier than Ruby. Like, there's a lot of abstraction, as anybody who's ever dealt with Ruby, which is all of us.
So basically any language though is easier than Ruby, to be fair, right? That's
I mean, I don't know. I've seen shit shows in all kinds of languages.
Except for PHP. I won't like, I'm not.
No, PHP is amazing. Yeah, no problems there. Fucking great. Yeah, no, shit. Yeah, no, with I can't even keep a straight face like talking about PhD. Damn you, Seth. What was I saying? Oh, Go. Yeah, Go is Go is so much like cleaner and easier for me to read. I'm sure it's like that for I have to imagine it's like that for everybody, because it's so succinct, and there's just not like a bunch of craziness and like meta programming style kind of craziness, or even just like different abstractions, like it's very easy to follow. It's very like what you see is like what you see, and that's how it's going to behave. And it's not a ton of tracing like I've seen with other languages and frameworks. So thumbs
Yeah,
up for me so far.
unless you use channels, and then it can get a little bit hairy because you're like, wait, what happened here? And so channels are a little bit more confusing. But I think that's also gives you like the power to do like multi-threaded kind of things as well. So that's useful from that perspective. But the first time I looked at it, I was like, what? How is this working?
Now, if you're doing that, you should go back to a true hipster Erlang Elixir language, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you need channels and multi-threading, that's the.
Yeah, but I mean, there's there's never issues with concurrency and with running things and running multiple threads, and never any issues there, right? So
No.
I mean, I guess what I'm saying is always weird, given like it can always go weird, like not just one language, right? Like Go is not just the only. But yeah, I mean, so far I've enjoyed it. I haven't written a ton of it though. Like, I don't know.
Well, I'm seeing a lot of security tooling, and maybe you're seeing the same thing, right? With Kubernetes and all these DevOps tools that are written in Go. I'm seeing a lot of security people move that direction as well, and actually take their, it used to be that Python was the go-to for all security tools, but that's not the case anymore. I'm seeing quite a bit of Go being used to write those tools nowadays as well. So.
Yeah, and I think part of that comes back to a lot of DevOps folks, like hardcore operations folks, have ended up moving from Python to Go. And I think part of that has to do with just like, hey, it's like so easy to build it, and it's also like easy to deploy it as well. And so we've noticed a lot of shift in the DevOps community with that. And I think it kind of makes sense from a security perspective as well, because it's like I'm kind of naive about it, but I do feel like a lot of security folks spend time building tools, and then they need to, get traction with those tools, inside your different environments or your at your place of work. And developers are like, I don't want to install like Python on my machine or whatever to do all the stuff. And I think devs in general get frustrated pretty quickly. Or maybe as technologists, we get frustrated pretty quickly and just kind of focus on the problem at hand. And if we can't solve it pretty quickly, we kind of move on to something else. And Go really helps with that, because it's like, oh, I just need to, here's the syntax that I need to actually run the application, and there it is running. And so that's been I think one of the biggest things about it that's been useful to like bring different communities together.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, really, Python, you just need like pip install, right? That's the only thing, and it'll all work after that, right?
You know what? Side rant about fucking Python. They call it global variables, and I just want to be very clear after this last week of misery and torture dealing with Python. They are not called. They should not be called global variables. They're not really global variables. That's just my little rant of this little session about Python. I don't know. Have you either of you dealt with global variables, as they call it in Python?
Well, yeah, but they're all scoped, so
right, which isn't global.
It's not global, right?
Yeah, that I didn't know that up until.
Come on, that's your what, PHP developer coming out, right? You want true global variables.
You have that in Go.
What's that?
You have that in Go. There's no, if it's outside your package, it's global.
Thank goodness for some sanity. Yeah, no, I mean that was a bit of my last week here and there, not the whole week, eating up on some nonsense like that. So
at least you
had to rant.
The right version of Python, unlike me. I was like, why does this not work? And I was like, oh,
why does this print statement keep? Oh, that's right. It's Python 3 and not Python 2. Everything's a function.
You need them parentheses. Yeah.
Anyway, so language aside, let's go back to DevOps a little bit, right? We always kind of we gear kind of a section of this to somebody getting into the industry or getting into it. I mean, we've kind of talked about the security tools that are available, but if someone was to come to you and ask, hey, I need to learn about DevOps and containers and, Kubernetes, where would you recommend that they start? Number one, how did you do it? But what would you recommend? What resources or websites or people would you recommend?
Sure. That's a large question, but I think just from a basic like DevOps perspective, it's useful to kind of go to like a DevOps Days. DevOps Days is like a 2-day conference. If you look at DevOpsDays.org, it's in literally every city in the world has it at some point in time. And I think I did a talk on this last year, and we had done DevOps Days was in it had happened in 165 cities or something like that by the end of last year. So that's really popular in the DevOps community, and that's kind of like if like the first time I went to it, which was in 2012 in Austin, that empowered me to realize, there's really there's a lot of people that are solving similar problems to what I'm solving in my large enterprise. So I had access to folks doing similar things and like hearing about problems that people were working on. So that's a great resource. There's the DevOps Handbook, if for the folks that like to read different things. That's by like Gene Kim and all of the DevOps Illuminati kind of pulled together to write that book, which is awesome, and it's a great just a great book to read. There's also, if you're trying to convince your management, like, hey, we should really get off the ops bandwagon and start thinking about working interactively with our developers and do this DevOps thing. Gene Kim wrote this book called The Phoenix Project, which is I always say like you should read it, but it's always like good to convince like your management. So like give your management that book, and that I think that's a good idea. In terms of like courses and stuff, there's some stuff out there. Like I think the DevOps Institute has like a DevOps course that you can. I don't know if it's online or whether you have to actually go somewhere to take it, but there's that. For folks that are on like LinkedIn Learning or lynda.com, James Wickett and Ernest Muller, they have like a course on just intro to DevOps. It's a pretty long course. I think it's like 3 hours or something like that, but they kind of go like head to toe. And Ernest actually wrote, if you Google like what is DevOps, he has like the #2 most popular blog article on LinkedIn or on Google on the Agile Admin site. And so he actually kind of like succinctified, if that's a word, what he thought about DevOps from like an operational standpoint. So that's kind of like a good place to start about. So a lot of those are general kind of things. If you're a developer or if you're an ops person if you're a developer who wants to do more operations-y kind of things, I think it's good to look at how like specific tooling works. I don't know what it'll depend. If you're a company, they use Chef or they use Puppet or something like that. Take a look at the cookbooks, because like it's just a Ruby cookbook. It's just code. So you can go and like, play with it and try and do different things. Maybe not like your production cookbook, but, just go and run a cookbook and you'll kind of understand, okay, well, this is how that stuff works. If you're an ops person going the other way, where you're trying to like do more, writing infrastructure as code, pick up something like Chef or Docker or, one of those kind of toolings to kind of, push yourself upwards. Closer towards developers, because like DevOps it's all in that middle, and I think that's a good place to go. From a Docker Kubernetes standpoint, there's like a lot of just Docker 101 courses out there. In fact, Mike, Rob, and I, Oracle has this conference called Oracle Code that goes around every year, and so we ended up giving like a Docker 101 lab. So that's like a good resource and it's like, if you've already done like Docker Hello World kind of stuff, you probably don't need to worry about it. But It just basically helps people get started with Docker. Kubernetes, from that standpoint, there's a free course on like intro to Kubernetes. I'll have to get you guys the link. I forget the name of the author, but that's a really good course. Kubernetes on the Kubernetes website also has like a lot of just material where I think CNCF and Kubernetes, the communities have realized that people are kind of swarming towards it now. And Kubernetes docs, they're good, but they're good for specific problems. And when you're getting started, you don't know what the problem you're actually trying to solve is.
Yeah.
So they're adding a lot more stuff. On Lynda, I actually gave, I did a class where I did like an intro to Kubernetes as well. So if you're a Lynda.com subscriber, feel free to check that out. And what else do I think is important from all that? Can't think of anything else top of my head, but if I do, I know where to post it.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, all that's helpful. We posted some of the links in the chat as you were talking through that. But definitely, anything that will help people just kind of understand where the pieces fit, especially even coming from the security side. And hey, I'm approaching a DevOps team. What do I need to know, right? Like we understand the tooling and how things are kind of being pushed out. But my next question to you was going to be where do you see security fitting in there, right? And specifically application security. A lot of the tools that I see for DevOps environments from a security perspective are very focused on the operating system. And and rightfully so, right? It's your infrastructure as code. You've got to make sure that that's up to date and there's no vulnerabilities there. But where do you see security fitting into the DevOps environment?
So like one thing I've noticed, which has gotten a lot of traction internally at Oracle, is we do the security team. Oracle is a large company, but like one of their teams we work with is a DevOps team, but they also have security folks embedded in the DevOps team. So they started with a platform to do just basic container testing. So like testing out your application, and that thing runs, in the monitoring code and whatnot. So, they run a suite of tests. The other thing they ended up doing is also adding security to that. So running security tests when you end up pushing your images. And that got a lot of traction from a developer standpoint, because when you're building a pipeline and you do your security, or you do your, you build and then you're doing your tests, those tests can not just be, unit tests or integration tests for your code, but you can also have like security tests sitting in there. And I think that kind of pushes like one thing, when I first looked at my first ever security scan result, like many years ago, I was like, I don't even know how to read this thing. And I was really scared because it was like a thick stack. And I was like, wow, there's a lot of, and it was not even a huge application, but it's like a thick stack of things to kind of read through. And I sat and read through the whole thing. And then I realized, oh, this is not that bad. This is like, it's categorized. But it was just like fear, because I'm like, wow, there's a big booklet to kind of look at. And I think, but if I'd seen that from I ran this tool ran this specific test, and here's what's wrong with the actual code base, I can go fix that pretty quickly. And I think that helps a lot from just a development perspective, so that you have eyes on it a lot quicker than like, okay, waiting a long time until the application is released, and then you're kind of doing security scanning or whatever after that. But Kubernetes actually has this thing called conformance tests, which is like, it's a large set of tests that kind of run through the Kubernetes infrastructure, and a lot of companies that either host Kubernetes or you're running Kubernetes internally, they always like run through those tests to make sure that they conform to a specific Kubernetes specification, and that runs through. I don't know if they have like a specific security section for that, but they do it for like all the different different layers in Kubernetes, like storage and networking and things like that. So I think that's if you're trying.
So those Kubernetes tests, those actually run against your software that you're pushing out. That's what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, it runs against like your Kubernetes infrastructure. So it'll go and like, for example, it'll go and build like pods and deployments and whatnot, and make sure that the storage layer that you're using underneath actually is like doing what Kubernetes expects it to do. So you're not kind of baking like a random Kubernetes thing up front. But the gist of it is like all of those things kind of are in the testing layer. And I think if you put security as a part of the pipeline, I think you end up getting a lot more people looking at it like way ahead in the development. What's it called? Like life cycle.
Yeah.
Later on, and I think that's where like stuff like there's an open source project like Gauntlet and stuff like that. Like all of those things kind of sit in there where it's like, oh no, I ran my unit tests, I ran my integration tests, I ran the security tests, everything passed. Okay, we feel more confident releasing this. Go along.
No, it's encouraging to hear you say that from the DevOps side, because that's one thing that I've been preaching for a while, is that the security testers, right? Application security testers specifically are just glorified QA testers, right? And realistically, they shouldn't be running it after something goes to production. They should be sitting right there in the middle with those integration tests, right? And that's where it makes the most sense. And, it's just a security payload. It's not really any different from the other QA payloads that are being thrown at the application. And you're looking for edge cases, right? They're all of those secure or like application testing methodologies that you learned in QA are very applicable to security testing. But if anything, the security testers they're pretty poor at actually following through with test plans and test cases like the QA engineers are. So I'm just glad to hear that somebody else is thinking along those same lines, because that makes the most sense to me as an ex-developer. Is that's where I would like to see it go, right? So.
Yeah, and I think that's how we win. Like, in the end, it's not about like security person. It's not about the ops person. It's really not about the developer. It's like whatever we put out as a company or product, like that thing has to be good and that we're putting out to people. And sometimes, in larger organizations, we forget that because, we have our goals that we have to hit by the end of the year, things like that. But like, if we're all working together to build, better software, that's really how we end up like winning and not having, random vulnerability issues or like just different things out in the wild.
Yeah. I mean, it's ensuring that the software is up to a certain standard, whether that's availability, whether that's security, whether it's, processing, what have you, right? But, without all those pieces in there, it won't happen. I mean, you go back to your initial, the initial security test report that you read, it was probably some PDF.
Yep.
Not even bug reports, and we still see that. That's still the kind of the industry standard. Right? Like when I do an application assessment, they don't ask, like I always offer, hey, guess what? Let me into your bug tracker. Like I'll create issues for you and just dump them straight into there. But it's still this, oh, well, we want that separate. So we're going to get this X, Y, and Z because we've got a compliance check that we have to hit. And yeah, it's kind of disheartening on that front because it feels like security is so tied up with compliance right now rather than it being a feature of the application or a part of the culture of developing code, right?
Yeah, and I think from dev perspective, in the end, like to us, it's a bug. It's like, oh, well, this
just has a different tag on it, right?
Correct. Yeah, and it's like I think when we found stuff before, when we ran a security scan, we were like, oh, you know what? I didn't even like think about that. Yeah, I should go fix that thing. And so, like, I think from a dev kind of fixing a problem, it's just a problem that we end up fixing. But sometimes there's process and things like that you have to add to it, which becomes like this larger and more scary thing in some ways.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I can't tell you the number of times that I'd be like, hey, guess what? I'll be talking to a developer. I'm like, hey, I found SQL injection. And they're like, where? And I'm like, well, it was on this page. Oh, yeah, no, I know that service. Yeah, that needs to be fixed, right? And I'm like, so,
Yeah.
okay, so my whole test was just a reminder to you to go fix the thing that you knew about, right? That's the favorite thing to look for in code reviews from a security perspective is, hey, let's look at the comments first, because that's going to point me at, this isn't done. I didn't implement authorization here, or to-dos,
Yeah, to-dos are the best. Just search for to-dos if that's a code review life hack.
Yeah, code review life hack. To-do, implement authorization here. Yeah.
That's funny, guys.
Yeah.
You know what? I had not thought of it that way from a dev perspective, but that's true. Because like we put notes to ourselves and it's like, oh yeah, that's like the easiest thing to kind of search for. If you have access to the source code, it's like, find out what's not done. And then
yeah. That's why we always tell developers, right? Your best security review is not like black box, it's white box, because we can go in and look and see, okay, number one, everything that the code's doing, but number two, all the developer notes that what's coming or what kind of flaws are still kind of exist in there. So.
Or the git commit message that says, I don't know why this won't work, but this crappy thing that's from a security perspective, this works. So fuck it, like push. You see those. So comments and git history.
Comments and git history. Yep, exactly. Well, let's see. We've been going for over an hour, guys. Ken, what haven't we gotten to on your list there?
I think we've gotten to because we kind of organically got into the to Karthik's sort of background. I guess the only thing really left is to I know Karthik, you have DevOps days coming up here May 3rd through May 4th. Is there anything you wanted to promote, anywhere you're going to be speaking, anywhere anything that people should know about, anything that you've got going on?
Oh yeah, so I'm actually speaking at DevOps Days this year. I'm giving a lightning talk on it's a random topic. So I'm going to be a new dad in a few weeks.
Congrats!
Thanks, man.
Woohoo.
And it's going to be like my first kid, and so my wife and I have been looking at just like everything that has to do with being like a new parent. And so my talk, it's a lightning talk about the parallels between DevOps and DataOps. And, like, all the things that are similar and like different and stuff. So I'm going to try and have some fun with that. And my biggest fear is like, I hope the kid doesn't happen before DevOps Days, but I'm pretty stoked to be giving that talk. Then I think, yeah, go ahead.
No. Yeah. I mean, that's prepare to not sleep for a while. Hopefully it's not as bad as some folks have it easier, but yeah, prepare for it. It's going to be fun, I'm sure.
Yeah, and then probably like so I'll be like kind of MIA for a little bit and then resurface and going back into doing, like we've been doing a lot of work on the Kubernetes front, getting like the managed service out, and I think it's going to GA in a couple of weeks. Like a couple of weeks from now. So since we have all a service built out, I'd actually be able to like go and talk about it more. So I'll probably like hit up some conferences later on, but right now it's just DevOps Days, and we're doing DevOps Days Austin a little bit differently, where it's DevOps Days has become more of like a conference where you have speakers kind of like presenting stuff to you, and then some sessions where you're kind of like interacting with your peers. But we're going to try a different approach this year, where people are going to come to the conference and kind of like vote on what talks they want to hear, and also spend more time like building community versus, like somebody preaching to you about, hey, this is what you should be doing, versus kind of like asking questions that you really want to be talking about up front and spending more time doing that. Because I think conferences, you go to like big conferences and you're like, man, like you just kind of sit in your spot and like listen to someone talk to you about stuff. And then you might take notes about like things you look up later, but we all get busy and we don't actually end up doing that. So hopefully this organic kind of setting is a little better. It's an experiment that we're trying at least.
Yeah, let us know how that goes, because I mean, there's a DevOps Days in Salt Lake City here where I'm at, but that's only a couple weeks after Austin.
Mhm.
And I've met the organizer there before, and it's definitely it sells out, right? Every year it sells out here for sure, right? There's just so many people that are interested in it. But I'd be interested in hearing just how that approach goes, right? We've been having a lot of talks about that with some of the security conferences that I'm involved in. Is, hey, guess what? How do we get away from the whole idea that speakers are, we have to have a speaker and then everybody just sits and listens, and people don't take away as much when they do that. There's not as much hands-on. There's not as much interaction as there is, even lightning talks, like you're saying, where you're getting people to sign up and talk about something they're interested in, are a little more conducive to actual conversation rather than just being talked at.
Yeah, I think the one thing I really like about LastCon, Lone Star Application Security that we do in town is like the number of people like they do multi-tracks, so there's like multiple talks going on at the same time, and so you end up, unless you're on like the main stage where you have like a lot of folks, the speaker to speakee ratio is manageable. So like you can kind of stop and like take questions at the time you're giving the talk and whatnot, and so you kind of build relationships. And that's kind of like it's funny because that's how I met Ken. Is like Ken had he said something during the talk and like that resonated with me at the time, and I was like, oh yeah, like I know who Ken is and I can kind of relate to him, and it just builds like your your set of people that you're like, hey, I jive with these people really well.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I love coming down there. I was at DevOps Days Austin last year, but LastCon, every time I miss LastCon, I'm so sad. Like it's what you said, is such a great people. I've spoken there a few times, but it's like the speaking. It's like just getting that out of the way, because everybody that's speaking there is, I want to hear them speak. Like it's like you have to do your obligatory, like you have to do your slide prep and you do your talk. But then this is one of those conferences where like, you're like, I just want to get that out of the way. And then I want to go look, or I want to, listen to all of these great speakers and, talk to these people. And also because you get that opportunity, especially with I'm getting down in the weeds here on this, but like just the like the table setups in the big room that they always have there at the Norris Conference Center, like it's conducive to everybody just sort of like sitting down, eating lunch together, doing whatever, having coffee, and just having great conversations. So it's like one of those ones where you definitely go to learn and meet great people.
Yeah, totally agree.
And DevOps Days Austin, that venue is amazing. I saw that it's at the same place, the Royal Texas Memorial Stadium. That was a very cool venue. So
it's crazy to look out and you're like looking at the football line or the 50-yard line from the conference center. So it's pretty awesome. I'm a huge fan.
Yeah, I was a booth babe last year. No joke. So I got to see some of the football players. They were doing practice, like down in the because we were loading some stuff up to bring up the elevator and like the staff sort of back room kind of stuff, and like you got to see them just coming out of practice, and they're all the football players just walking through. It was pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
So cool, good. I mean, the only other thing on our list was the RSA stuff. I mean, that's not necessarily Karthik related, I think.
Oh yeah, one thing we should talk about it, because like I looked over some of the stuff on my Twitter feed, and my Twitter feed is like a lot of DevOps people, developers, and like some security folks. But I did end up reading a bunch of stuff about like DevSecOps on there. There was a lot of, I guess there was also a DevSecOps day, which is great. And then shout out to James Wickett's talk that he gave on serverless and serverless security, and he kind of like unfolds that whole like paradigm in a way that's, I think, is interesting from not just a developer perspective but also from a security perspective. So I think that's a great slide deck to kind of take a look at.
Wait, so quick question. I'm seeing DevSecOps days at RSA Conference 2018, but Is that so? Is that like, was that just for RSA, or is that DevSecOps Day? Is that like a set of conferences that are going to be like DevOps days that are going around, like around the country or world?
I think I believe it's going to be like a set of conferences that happens around, kind of like DevOps days. Like Mark Miller will probably know a lot more on that, but I think it's kind of I think they're trying to build like the same kind of community aspect of things that DevOps has, but also bring like security into the picture in there. But I believe there was like a DevSecOps day like after RSA last week or something, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, I saw one on April 16th, but you mentioning it was the first time. Seth, had you heard about this before?
No, I hadn't. Well, I was just Googling it now. Like I had heard that it had gone on, but yeah, I mean, it just said 2018, right? That there was a DevSecOps days at RSAC. So
I got some decent speakers. Awesome. Oh, Derek Weeks is in there. Sweet.
Yeah.
James Wickett. I see James. Big fan of James Wickett. Yeah,
And not just because he's really tall.
Not just because he's really tall. Yeah. That what you all do there in organizing and bringing people together, it's amazing, as well as the like basically free security information you've given everyone, including tonight. We appreciate it. Before we go tonight, what is there anything like you want to leave people with, in terms of like where things are going, or anything you want to kind of put on people's mind before we sign off?
I do think that Kubernetes is going to be like a thing that's going to last for a long time. So if companies or folks listening are kind of thinking whether Kubernetes is a good idea or not, I think there's going to be like a large following for that going forward. So from a security point of view, to kind of think through like what are things that we need to do to fortify Kubernetes, application Kubernetes containers, etc. Also, if you're kind of a startup, you probably are thinking going towards more of what's it called? Why am I totally blanking on this? What's the event thing called?
Probably because it's late and we had you on here late. Our apologies.
Hey, no worries. Man, it's not Kubernetes, but it's like the new thing.
The new thing.
Is it like Kubernetes?
I'm sorry, serverless. I don't know.
Oh, serverless, yeah.
But yeah, if you're like a smaller startup company, you probably like will be going serverless just because it's easy to manage and stuff like that, like things we talked about. There are even lesser security patterns to follow over there. So if there's somebody like doing active security kind of related work, like talk more about it, or come hang out on the podcast, because those are things I think people are actively struggling with. But in general, DevOps kind of built a lot of working together between devs and ops, and I'm hoping DevSecOps kind of does the same thing, where it's like we're kind of all solving the same problem, building better applications as we go along. So let's do it together.
Well, I did want to thank you for joining us tonight, and again, being flexible with all the rescheduling and sharing all this great information with us, and especially your 2 weeks out, possibly 2 weeks out. So
yeah. Tell your significant other thank you as well. Right?
Yes.
Sure. No, I'm good to be here. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, no, and definitely want to do it again. And I'd love to maybe have, one or two other folks and make it kind of like a round table around DevSecOps or DevOps security, whatever you want to call it. I'm not cool enough to know all the names, but did want to mention a few things before we sign out. One is next week. We're May 1st. We're gonna have Kevin Cody back on. I think this time we're gonna talk more about tooling. I want to say mobile tooling.
Mobile tooling, yeah,
mobile security tooling testing. If you would like an invite to the Slack and Karthik, I'll make sure I get you on that Slack. Apologies for not doing that before the podcast. So if you want an invitation to our Slack, send an email to absoluteappsec@gmail.com, as well as if you have any suggestions or any questions, anything, any speaker suggestions, anything you want to hear or anything like that. Seth, anything to add to any of this?
No, just make sure and check the website. We will post the link to the YouTube channel and the latest video, and also the audio on the website itself. And hopefully we'll keep moving on that as well and making that more dynamic with what we're doing on the podcast side. But as of now, that's everything that I've got. But again, appreciate it, Karthik. Thanks for coming on.
Yes, thank you. We really do appreciate you sharing your time and info with us, and our knowledge with us.
Yeah.
You bet, guys. It was my pleasure.
Okay.
Awesome.
All right.
Well, all right. I'll sign us off. See everyone next Tuesday. Times are flexible, but we'll see you next Tuesday evening. Thanks again for joining us.
All right. Bye, everybody.
See you guys later.
Later.